The Vareth believed the problem was solved. They had burned Mars. They had broadcast the destruction to every corner of the galaxy. In their minds, humanity was now a broken species that would spend the rest of its existence quietly serving the Dominion, too afraid to ever raise its voice again. The Vareth governors on Earth filed reports that described a compliant population. Factories were producing goods for the Empire. Laborers were reporting to their assigned stations. Everything was in order. They had no idea what was happening in the dark places they could not see. Sam Harding's transmission had reached farther than he ever expected. In the days after the massacre, he received responses from dozens of scattered groups across the solar system. Survivors from Mars who had been in underground shelters or deep mines when the bombardment hit. Crews on ships that had been away from the planet when the attack came. Soldiers from the Martian Defense Forces who had been stationed on orbital platforms that managed to escape before the Vareth fleet turned its guns on them. And there was one response that changed everything. Captain Laura Bishop of the Human Navy had been commanding a patrol frigate called the Carthage near Jupiter when the order came from the puppet government on Earth to stand down and submit to Vareth authority. Laura was 41 years old, with short dark hair and a face that looked like it had been carved out of stone. She had served in the Navy for 20 years. She had followed orders her entire career. But this was one order she could not follow. She told her crew what had happened to Mars. She told them about the 10 billion dead. She told them about the surrender. Do you want to kneel, or do you want to fight? Every single person on that ship chose to fight. Laura took the Carthage into the asteroid belt and went silent. She shut down all communication systems, powered down every non-essential system, and hid her ship among the rocks, like a wolf waiting in tall grass. When she heard Sam Harding's message, she answered immediately. Within a week, she and Sam were working together. They chose Callisto as their base. It was one of Jupiter's moons, a frozen world covered in ice and craters, with abandoned mining complexes that went deep beneath the surface. It was cold and dark and miserable, but it was also far from any major Vareth patrol routes, and its underground tunnels provided perfect cover from orbital scans. The survivors came in small groups at first, a shuttle here, a cargo ship there, people arriving with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the grief in their hearts. Within a month, more than 30,000 people had gathered on Callisto. Engineers, soldiers, doctors, teachers, miners, pilots, ordinary people who had decided that they would rather freeze on a forgotten moon than live on their knees. A former Martian senator named Danny Cortez took on the job of organizing them. Danny was 38, a tall man with kind eyes and a voice that could fill a room without shouting. He had been off-world on a diplomatic mission when Mars burned. His wife and 2 daughters had been in Meridian Hub. He never found out exactly when they died. He only knew that they were gone, and that the empire that killed them was still out there, still ruling, still believing it could do whatever it wanted. Danny stood in the main hall of the Callisto base, a rough stone cavern that had once been a loading dock for ore haulers, and addressed the growing crowd of survivors. They burned our home, he said. They killed our families. They broadcast it like it was a show. They wanted us to be afraid. And I will not lie to you. I am afraid. But I am also angry. And anger, when it has purpose, is the most dangerous thing in this galaxy. The resistance took shape quickly, because it had to. Laura Bishop organized the military side. She divided the fighters into small, independent units that could operate on their own if communication was cut. She studied every piece of Vareth technology they could get their hands on, looking for weaknesses, and she found them. The Vareth built their weapons and defenses for a specific kind of war. They expected to fight large fleets in open space, where their superior firepower and shielding would crush any opponent. They did not expect enemies who hid behind rocks. They did not expect enemies who used mining equipment as weapons. They did not expect enemies who would strap explosives to a cargo drone and fly it into a warship's engine exhaust. The Verith had fought the same way for 2,000 years, and they had never needed to adapt. That was about to become a very serious problem for them. Sam Harding threw himself into his work with a focus that bordered on obsession. He slept 3 or 4 hours a night, and spent the rest of his time in the makeshift workshops the engineers had built in the lower tunnels. He studied the captured Verith components, and realized that their shield generators operated on a specific electromagnetic frequency. If you could hit that frequency with a strong enough pulse, the shields would collapse for a short time before rebooting. It was a window of maybe 60 to 90 seconds, but it was enough. He built the first electromagnetic pulse warhead from salvaged parts and mining explosives. It was ugly and rough and looked like something a desperate person would make, because that was exactly what it was. But when they tested it on a captured Verith shield emitter, the shield dropped like a curtain falling from a rod. Sam stared at the dead emitter and smiled for the first time since Mars burned. Meanwhile, on Earth, a woman named Grace Mulligan was building a different kind of weapon. Grace was 44, a school teacher from a city called Portland who had moved to Earth from Mars 10 years earlier. Her parents had stayed behind on Mars. Her sister had stayed. Her sister's 2 young boys had stayed. They were all gone now, buried under glass and ash in what had been the city of Dusthaven. Grace did not have military training. She did not know how to fire a gun or pilot a ship, but she knew how to organize people, how to earn trust, how to move through a crowd without being noticed, and how to keep a secret. She built a spy network that stretched across every major Verith installation on Earth. Janitors who memorized patrol schedules, and more. Dock workers who copied cargo manifests. Technicians who installed hidden listening devices in Verith communication rooms. Every piece of information flowed back to Callisto through a chain of couriers and coded transmissions that the Verith never detected. Grace also organized sabotage. Small things at first. A fuel line cut here. A navigation relay scrambled there. Nothing big enough to trigger a major response, but enough to cause confusion and waste the Verith's time. Every act of sabotage sent a message to the people around it. Someone is fighting. You are not alone. 3 months after the massacre, the resistance had grown beyond anything Sam or Laura or Danny had imagined. Over 200,000 people had joined. They had hundreds of ships, most of them converted civilian vessels fitted with weapons and armor plating. They had a supply chain running through the outer solar system. They had spies on Earth, and intelligence on every Verith installation within their reach. Laura Bishop stood in the command center on Callisto, looking at a holographic map that showed the positions of Verith patrols, supply routes, and bases. The map was covered in red markers, representing the enemy. There were so many of them. The Verith still outnumbered the resistance by a factor that was almost ridiculous to think about. Sam Harding walked up beside her and looked at the same map. "We are still outgunned," he said. "Yes," Laura said. "We could still lose everything." "Yes." Sam was quiet for a moment. "So when do we start?" Laura looked at him. There was something in her eyes that was not quite hope and not quite rage, but something in between, something that burned steady and would not go out. "Soon," she said. "Very soon. They think they killed Mars, Sam. But Mars is not a place. It is every single one of us who remembers what they did. And we remember." Sam nodded. He went back to his workshop and kept building. In the darkness of Callisto, in the cold tunnels beneath the ice, the resistance prepared for war. They had no guarantee of victory. They had no certainty of survival. But they had something the Verith had never faced before and did not understand. They had 10 billion reasons to fight, and they would not stop until the galaxy knew every single one of them. The operation was called Red Remembrance, and it was launched exactly 100 days after the massacre. Laura Bishop had chosen the date deliberately. She wanted the Verith to understand that humans counted their dead, and that humans kept track of time, and that when humans said they would not forget, they meant it down to the day. The target was a Verith orbital fortress called the Crucible. It hung in orbit above Earth like a dark iron moon, bristling with weapon platforms and shielded by energy barriers that could stop a barrage from an entire fleet. The Crucible was the nerve center of everything the Verith did in the solar system. All orders flowed through it. All intelligence was processed there. All communication with the Verith homeworld was routed through its relay systems. If the Crucible fell, the entire Verith occupation would be blinded and confused, at least for a while. Taking it down by direct assault was impossible, even if she threw every ship the Resistance had at the Crucible. The station's defenses would shred them before they got close enough to do real damage. She needed another way in. Grace Mulligan provided it. Grace's network on Earth had spent weeks studying the Crucible's supply chain. Every 3 days, shuttles carrying food, equipment, and conscripted human laborers went up to the station from surface depots. The security on these shuttles was surprisingly loose. The Verith did not expect threats to come from inside their own supply lines. They checked the cargo for weapons and explosives with standard scanners, but they did not look too closely at the laborers themselves, and they did not examine food containers beyond a surface scan. Grace and Sam Harding had spent 2 weeks designing something they called a ghost charge. It was an EMP device small enough to fit inside a sealed food canister, built entirely from non-metallic components that would not trigger Verith scanners. Each one had to be assembled by hand, and each one was barely powerful enough to knock out a light fixture. But Sam did not need them to knock out light fixtures. He needed 26 of them, detonated at the same time in the same room, to produce a combined pulse strong enough to kill a shield generator. 26 volunteers were chosen for the infiltration. They would go up to the Crucible disguised as conscripted laborers, carrying the ghost charges hidden in food containers. Once aboard, they would have to find the shield generator compartment, plant the charges, and detonate them at a precise time that was coordinated with the fleet attack outside. The team was led by Kyle Dunn, a former Marine from Mars, who had been off-planet on a training exercise when the bombardment happened. Kyle was 29, built like a wall, with a shaved head and calm brown eyes that never seemed to blink when things got dangerous. He had volunteered for the mission without hesitation. When Danny Cortez asked him if he understood the risks, Kyle had simply said, "I understand perfectly. That is why I am going." The days before the operation were tense. Laura Bishop ran simulation after simulation in the Callisto Command Center, refining the timing down to the second. Sam Harding finished his other project, the one he had been working on in secret for weeks. He called it the Pale Horse. It was a decommissioned cargo hauler, a big ugly ship that had spent its working life moving ore between mining stations. Sam had gutted it, filled it with every mining explosive the Resistance could spare, and overcharged its engines to push it to a speed that the original designers never intended. It was a missile disguised as a ship, and it would be piloted remotely from the Carthage. On the morning of the strike, Kyle Dunn and his 26 volunteers boarded a supply shuttle at a depot outside the city of Geneva. They wore the gray coveralls of conscripted workers. They carried the food containers with the ghost charges packed carefully inside. A Verith guard scanned the containers, saw nothing unusual, and waved them through. Kyle kept his eyes down and his face blank, and his heart beating so hard he was sure everyone around him could hear it. The shuttle docked at the Crucible 40 minutes later. The infiltrators were processed and assigned to work details in the lower decks. Over the next several hours, moving carefully and quietly through the station's corridors, they made their way toward the shield generator compartment. Grace Mulligan's intelligence had provided them with detailed maps of the station's layout, and Kyle had memorized every corridor, every junction, every security checkpoint. They reached the shield generator room at 0347 hours station time. It was a large chamber deep in the heart of the crucible, humming with the constant vibration of the massive machines that kept the station's energy barriers active. 2 Verith technicians were on duty. Kyle and 2 of his team handled them silently. They placed the ghost charges around the room, wired them together, and set the timer for exactly 0400 hours. Then they left. They could not get off the station. They knew that. The plan had never included an extraction. Kyle and his team moved to the nearest airlock, sealed themselves inside, and waited. If the mission succeeded, Laura Bishop's fleet would pick them up. If it failed, the airlock would be their tomb. At 0400 hours, the ghost charges detonated. The combined electromagnetic pulse ripped through the shield generator compartment and killed every system in it. The crucible shields, those impenetrable energy barriers that could stop a fleet, flickered and died. Alarms screamed across the station. Verith officers shouted orders. Technicians scrambled to reboot the generators. They estimated it would take 90 seconds to bring the shields back online. They would not get 90 seconds. Laura Bishop's fleet had been hiding behind the moon, engines cold, running on minimal power to avoid detection. The moment the crucible's shields dropped, Laura gave the order. 63 ships, most of them converted freighters and mining vessels, with welded-on armor plating and bolted-on weapons, surged out from behind the moon and opened fire with everything they had. Missiles and railgun rounds slammed into the unshielded station. Explosions tore through the outer hull. Weapon platforms that had never been touched by enemy fire were ripped apart. The Verith crew fought back with small arms and internal defense systems, but without shields, the crucible was naked against the assault. And then Sam Harding fired the Pale Horse. He guided it from the bridge of the Carthage, watching through the remote pilot feed as the overloaded cargo hauler accelerated toward the crucible at a speed that made the structural frame groan and shake. Verith point defense guns tried to shoot it down, but the Pale Horse was moving too fast, and there were too many other targets for them to focus on. The Pale Horse hit the crucible's reactor section dead center. The explosion was so bright that it whited out every camera feed within 1,000 kilometers. For a moment, a new star appeared in the sky above Earth, and people on the surface looked up and saw it, and did not know what it meant. The crucible broke apart. The massive station, the symbol of Verith authority in the solar system, split into burning fragments that tumbled through orbit and began their slow fall toward the atmosphere below. Over 4,000 Verith soldiers died in the explosion and the fires that followed. The puppet government's senior officials, who had been stationed aboard the crucible for their own protection, died with them. The Carthage swung close to the crucible's wreckage and picked up Kyle Dunn and 19 of his 26 volunteers from the airlock where they had been waiting. 7 had been caught by Verith security in the chaos after the EMP and had fought to the last. Kyle carried no expression on his face when he came aboard. He simply asked Laura when the next mission was. The Resistance broadcast a message on the same galactic frequency the Verith had used to show the massacre of Mars. It showed a crucible burning, breaking, falling, and across the bottom of the feed, in simple white letters, were 2 words: Mars remembers. Across the galaxy, beings of every species watched in silence. The Verith had told them that resistance was impossible. The Verith had told them that defiance meant death. And now they were watching a Verith fortress burn, because a handful of humans with homemade weapons and stolen ships and broken hearts had decided that impossible was not a word they recognized anymore. On the Verith homeworld, Korath Vel watched the footage in his war chamber. His advisors stood around him in terrified silence. He stared at the burning remains of the crucible for a long time. His clawed hands gripped the arms of his throne so tightly that the stone cracked beneath his fingers. "Send the 8th Fleet," he said. His voice was quiet, but every person in that room heard it and felt cold. "Every ship, go to that system and kill everything that breathes. Leave nothing alive." The Varith 8th Fleet, 300 capital warships, and the most powerful military force in the known galaxy, began its long march toward the solar system. But in the command center on Callisto, Laura Bishop was already looking at the intelligence reports that Grace Mulligan's spies had sent. She knew the fleet was coming. She knew its size. She knew its route. And she was not afraid. "Good," she said to Sam, who was standing beside her, with grease on his hands and exhaustion in his eyes. "Let them come. We will be ready." The Varith 8th Fleet entered the solar system like a storm rolling across open water. 300 capital warships, each 1 kilometers long, each one carrying enough firepower to level a continent. They moved in perfect formation, a wall of dark metal and glowing engines stretching across the void, so wide that it looked like someone had built a city in space and sent it to war. Their commander was Fleet Admiral Cyrax Den, a veteran of 40 campaigns who had never lost a battle. His orders from Korath Vel were the simplest he had ever received. Kill everything. No negotiations, no prisoners, no mercy. Find every human hiding in every hole and crack in the solar system and end them. When it was done, there should be nothing left of the species that had dared to embarrass the Dominion. Cyrax Den expected the operation to take less than a week. He was wrong. The Resistance had 41 days between the destruction of the Crucible and the arrival of the 8th Fleet. They used every hour. Sam Harding barely slept during that time. He lived in the asteroid belt, supervising teams of engineers who were turning millions of cubic meters of rock and ice and empty space into the largest trap ever built. They mined the asteroids, not for ore, but with explosives. Thousands of charges were planted deep inside rocks of every size, connected to remote detonators that could be triggered from any Resistance ship within range. Navigation beacons were reprogrammed to send false signals that would lead Varith sensors to see threats where there were none, and miss threats that were right in front of them. Decoy ships were scattered through the belt, hollow shells fitted with signal emitters that made each one look like a fully armed warship on a scanner. The Varith would think they were facing a fleet 10 times the size of the actual Resistance. Laura Bishop designed the battle plan. It was built on one simple idea: never fight the Varith on their terms. The 8th Fleet was designed for open space combat, where its massive ships could form firing lines and use their shields and weapons to overwhelm any opponent. In the belt, surrounded by thousands of tumbling rocks and clouds of dust and debris, those advantages would shrink. The big ships would be slow to turn. Their sensors would be cluttered. Their formations would break apart as they navigated through the obstacles. She divided her forces into 12 independent strike groups, each one led by a commander she trusted. Her orders to them were simple and clear: hit them and hurt them and disappear. Never let them pin you down. Never engage in a straight fight. Make them chase you. Make them split up to find you. And then hit the ones that are alone. The 8th Fleet reached the outer edge of the asteroid belt on a Tuesday morning by Earth time. Cyrax Den ordered his ships forward in standard hunting formation, spread wide to cover as much area as possible. His sensors showed hundreds of enemy ships scattered through the belt. He smiled. This would be like hunting animals in a forest. The first detonation wiped the smile off his face. Sam Harding triggered a chain of explosive charges buried inside a cluster of asteroids directly in the path of the Varith forward screen. The rocks did not just explode. They shattered into thousands of fragments that were hurled outward at tremendous speed by the force of the blasts. It was like a shotgun fired at close range, and the Verith ships were the target. 9 were destroyed outright, torn apart by chunks of rock the size of buildings, moving fast enough to punch through hull plating. 8 more were crippled, their engines or weapons knocked out, left drifting and burning among the debris. Cyrax's den had lost 17 ships before the battle had even properly begun. He ordered his fleet to slow down and proceed with caution. This was exactly what Laura Bishop wanted. Slow ships in the belt were sitting targets. The strike groups attacked. They came from every direction at once, darting out from behind asteroids in groups of 3 or 5, firing volleys of SAM's EMP warheads at the nearest Verith ships, and then diving back into the cover of the rocks before the Verith guns could track them. Each attack lasted less than a minute. Each attack left at least one Verith ship with its shields down, or its sensors scrambled, and each time the Verith turned to pursue, they found nothing but empty space and floating rock. The fighting went on for 3 days. The Verith had the firepower to destroy the Resistance 100 times over, but they could not find it. Their sensors were confused by the decoys and the reprogrammed beacons. Their large ships kept getting stuck in narrow passages between asteroids. Their smaller escort ships, sent ahead to scout, were picked off one by strike groups that appeared, struck, and vanished like ghosts. Kyle Dunn led one of the most daring actions of the battle. His team identified a Verith destroyer that had been separated from the main fleet and was drifting with damaged engines near a large asteroid. Kyle took 3 boarding shuttles and 50 fighters and hit the destroyer before its crew knew what was happening. They fought through the corridors of the ship in close combat, room by room, deck by deck, until they reached the command bridge and took control. Kyle turned the destroyer's own weapons on 2 nearby Verith cruisers, firing at point-blank range before destroying the ship's reactor and evacuating his team. The 2 cruisers were gutted. The destroyer exploded behind them as they flew away. On Earth, Grace Mulligan launched a coordinated uprising. Resistance cells in 12 major cities attacked Verith garrisons at the same time. They bombed fuel depots, destroyed communication relays, and freed conscripted workers from labor camps. The attacks were not large enough to drive the Verith off Earth, but they forced the Dominion to divert attention and resources away from the belt at the worst possible time. By the 3rd day, Cyrax's den was losing his composure. He had lost over 100 ships. His officers were reporting contacts everywhere and hitting nothing. His supply lines were being harassed by Resistance raiders operating behind his fleet. He was fighting an enemy he could not see, could not predict, and could not pin down, and his frustration was turning to something he had never felt in his military career: doubt. On the 4th day, Sam Harding revealed his final weapon. He called it the Requiem. It was the biggest electromagnetic pulse device ever built by human hands, assembled from salvaged Verith components and human engineering on a converted asteroid mining platform. It was not elegant. It was a massive, crude, brutal machine that did one thing: generate an electromagnetic pulse powerful enough to shut down every electronic system within a radius of 500 kilometers. Laura Bishop spent the morning of the 4th day luring a concentration of Verith ships into the Requiem's range. She used the last of her decoys, broadcasting fake fleet signals from a dense cluster of asteroids. 47 warships converged on the cluster, forming a tight group as they prepared to deliver a killing blow to what they thought was the main Resistance force. Sam fired the Requiem. The pulse expanded outward in an invisible wave. When it hit the 47 Verith ships, every system on every vessel died at the same instant. Shields collapsed, weapons went offline, engines cut out, lights went dark. 47 warships, each one a machine of incredible technological power, became 47 dead metal boxes floating in the void. The Resistance fleet moved in. It took them less than 20 minutes to destroy all 47. Some of the Vareth crew tried to restart their systems. Some tried to fight with handheld weapons through open airlocks. The ships were helpless, and the Resistance showed them the same mercy the Vareth had shown Mars. None. By the end of the 4th day, the Vareth 8th Fleet had lost 178 ships. Cyrax Den, with barely a third of his force remaining, and most of those damaged, did something that no Vareth fleet commander had ever done in the history of the Dominion. He ordered a retreat. The remaining ships of the 8th Fleet turned and ran. They fled the asteroid belt, fled the solar system, and did not stop until they were well beyond the range of anything the Resistance could throw at them. Cyrax Den filed his report with a shaking hand and waited for the response from the homeworld, knowing that his career and likely his life were over. The Resistance broadcast the footage of the battle across every galactic communication channel. There were no words this time, no slogans, no speeches, just the images. Vareth warships burning, breaking, running. The mighty Dominion, the empire that had conquered 9,000 star systems, fleeing from a species it had tried to erase. Across the galaxy, other subject species watched those images and felt something stir inside them. A feeling they had almost forgotten. A feeling the Vareth had spent 2,000 years trying to crush out of every being they ruled. Hope. Danny Cortez stood in the command center on Callisto, surrounded by cheering, crying, exhausted people. And he felt it too, but he also felt the weight of what was coming. The Vareth would not accept this defeat. They would come back, and next time they would come with everything they had. He looked at Laura, who was slumped in her command chair, with blood on her uniform from a shrapnel wound she had not bothered to treat. "They will come back," he said. "I know," she said. "Can we do this again?" Laura looked at the map, at the scattered remains of the 8th Fleet, still retreating on the long-range sensors. "Not alone," she said. "Not against everything they have. We need help." Danny nodded slowly. He had already been thinking the same thing. The broadcast had gone to every corner of the galaxy. Every subject species had seen what humanity had done. The question now was whether any of them were brave enough to join. "Then we ask," Danny said. "We ask everyone." The news of the 8th Fleet's defeat spread through the Dominion of Vareth like a crack spreading through ice. It was small at first, a rumor passed between traders, a whispered conversation between officers who could not believe what they were reading in the reports. But it grew. Within days, every species in the Empire knew what had happened. A subject race, a species the Vareth had tried to exterminate on live broadcast, had beaten the most powerful fleet the Dominion had sent against anyone in living memory. For 2,000 years, the foundation of the Vareth Empire had been a single idea. Resistance is pointless. Every conquered species had learned that lesson. Every governor enforced it. Every fleet existed to prove it. And now a group of humans hiding in an asteroid belt with homemade weapons had shattered that idea in 4 days. Korath Vel understood what was at stake. This was not just a military problem. This was an existential threat to the entire structure of his empire. If one species could fight back and survive, others would try. He had to destroy humanity completely and visibly, or the Dominion itself would begin to unravel. He assembled the Grand Armada. Every available warship in the Empire was recalled from every sector, every patrol route, every garrison. Over 2,000 capital ships, the largest fleet the galaxy had ever seen, gathered at the Vareth homeworld. Korath Vel announced that he would lead the Armada personally. He broadcast his intentions to every system in the Dominion, and his words were chosen to remind every subject species of their place. "I will go to their star and erase every trace of their kind from existence. When I am done, even the memory of them will be ashes." On Callisto, Danny Cortez watched the broadcast with Laura Bishop and Sam Harding in the command center. The room was quiet. 2,000 warships against a resistance fleet that had been battered in the Battle of the Belt and had maybe 300 operational ships left. The numbers were not just bad, they were hopeless. "We cannot win this alone," Laura said, stating what everyone already knew. Danny had already made his decision. He had been thinking about it since the moment the Eighth Fleet retreated. The broadcast of that retreat had gone to every corner of the galaxy. Every subject species had seen it. The question was whether seeing it was enough to make them act. He sent envoys to every species in the Dominion, the Terrani, a race of tall, slender beings who had been conquered 300 years ago. The Belvari, an aquatic species whose homeworld the Varith had drained of its oceans to fuel their ships. The Kesith, an insectoid people who had been used as expendable labor in Varith mining operations for centuries, and who had lost more of their own to the Empire than any other species, and dozens more, each with their own history of suffering under Varith rule. Danny's message to each of them was the same. You watched them burn our world. You watched us fight back. Now they are coming to finish us. When we fall, you will be next. Every species that has ever thought about freedom will learn that it is impossible after all. Fight with us now, or kneel alone forever. Then he waited. They all waited. The days passed slowly on Callisto. Sam Harding worked without rest, repairing ships, building weapons, preparing everything he could. Laura Bishop planned defensive positions around the outer solar system, knowing that even the best plan would not survive contact with a fleet that size. Grace Mulligan organized the evacuation of as many Earth civilians as possible into deep underground shelters, working against the clock and against the Varith patrols that still occupied the planet. For weeks, there was silence from the galaxy. Danny began to wonder if he had been wrong. Maybe fear was stronger than hope. Maybe 2,000 years of obedience had crushed the will to fight out of every species the Varith had conquered. Maybe humanity would die alone. Then the first message came. It was from the Kesith. A single line of text, translated from their language. We come. The Kesith sent 200 warships. They were not large ships, and they were not advanced ships. But each one carried a crew that had been waiting for this moment for generations. Behind the Kesith came the Belvari, with 90 cruisers built in secret shipyards hidden beneath the frozen surface of their ruined world. Then the Terrani, with 60 fast attack vessels, crewed by soldiers who had trained in hidden camps for decades. Then species Danny had never heard of. Species the Varith had conquered so long ago that the galaxy had forgotten their names. Small fleets, sometimes only a handful of ships, arriving from every direction. By the time the Grand Armada reached the edge of the solar system, an allied fleet of over 1,000 ships, representing 23 different species, was waiting alongside the human resistance beyond the orbit of Neptune. It was still outnumbered 2-1, but it was something the galaxy had never seen before. A coalition of the conquered, united not by an empire's threats, but by a shared refusal to be afraid anymore. The final battle began on a cold morning by Earth's calendar. The Grand Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel, in a formation that stretched across millions of kilometers of space. Korath Vel stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Throne of Eternity, and looked at the Allied fleet on his sensors. He saw the ships of 23 species arrayed against him, and for the first time in his long reign, he felt a flicker of something he did not recognize. It took him a moment to understand what it was. It was uncertainty. He crushed it. He gave the order to attack. The battle lasted 6 days. It was the largest naval engagement in the history of the galaxy, and it was fought with a ferocity that neither side had ever experienced. The Verith had numbers and firepower. The Allies had desperation and fury, and a willingness to pay any price. Human pilots flew their ships directly into the engines of Verith dreadnoughts, detonating on impact and taking the massive vessels with them. Tyranny cruisers placed themselves between damaged Allied ships and incoming fire. Kessith swarm fighters, small and fast, and numbering in the thousands, overwhelmed Verith point defense systems through sheer volume, clearing the way for heavier Allied ships to close in and strike. Every species fought in its own way, using its own strengths, and together they created a kind of warfare the Verith had no manual for and no answer to. A Belvari ship would jam a Verith cruiser's sensors, while a human strike group hit it from the flank, while Kessith fighters swarmed its weapons platforms. Each piece alone would have been swatted aside. Together, they were devastating. The losses were terrible. Ships on both sides burned and broke and went dark. The void between Neptune and the outer dark, filled with wreckage and frozen bodies and the silent expanding clouds of debris that had once been warships and their crews. On the fourth day of the battle, Laura Bishop took the Carthage and a strike group of 12 ships directly at the throne of eternity. She had spent 3 days waiting for an opening, watching the flagship's position, studying its shield rotation patterns, looking for a moment of vulnerability. She found one when the throne shifted its shield power to its port side to absorb a Tyranny torpedo barrage, leaving the aft section momentarily weakened. The Carthage was hit 6 times on the approach. 2 of the 12 ships in the strike group were destroyed. Laura's bridge was burning, her hull was breached in 4 places, and 3 of her crew were dead at their stations. She drove the Carthage forward, firing every weapon she had at the flagship's weakened aft shields. Sam Harding was aboard a support ship 200 kilometers away. He had saved one last Requiem charge, the final electromagnetic pulse warhead the Resistance possessed. He had been carrying it for this moment. He loaded it into a torpedo tube, aimed at the Throne of Eternity's shield array, and fired. The torpedo hit. The EMP pulse expanded. The Throne of Eternity's shields died for 12 seconds. Laura Bishop saw the shields fall on her tactical display. She did not hesitate. She aimed the Carthage at the flagship's engine section and pushed the engines to full. The burning frigate, trailing fire and debris, crossed the remaining distance in seconds and struck the Throne of Eternity with the force of a small asteroid. The explosion tore the flagship in half. The forward section, containing the bridge where Korath Vel stood, was consumed in a fireball that burned so bright it registered on sensors across the entire battlefield. The supreme archon of the Dominion of Verith, the ruler of 9,000 star systems, the being who had ordered the death of 10 billion people and broadcast it as a lesson, died in fire and silence and the crushing darkness of space. Laura Bishop died with him. The Carthage was gone. There was nothing left of it to recover. When word spread across the battlefield that the Throne of Eternity was destroyed and Korath Vel was dead, the Verith fleet broke. Ships that had fought with disciplined precision for 4 days began to scatter. Commanders who had followed orders without question suddenly had no one to give orders. The Grand Armada, the mightiest fleet ever assembled, came apart like a machine with its central gear removed. The Allies pressed the attack. By the 6th day, the Verith were in full retreat, fleeing toward the edges of the solar system and beyond. In the days that followed, the dominion of Verith collapsed. Province after province declared independence. Governors who had ruled through fear found that fear had evaporated overnight. Subject species rose up on 100 worlds simultaneously. The empire that had stood for 2,000 years fell apart in weeks, brought down not by a single blow, but by the simple spreading realization that it could be brought down at all. 1 month after the battle, Danny Cortez stood on the surface of Mars. He stood in the crater that had been New Providence, surrounded by the red dust and the silence of a world that still bore the scars of what had been done to it. Beside him stood representatives of every species that had fought in the coalition. Sam Harding stood there too, his hands still scarred from years of building weapons in cold tunnels, his eyes tired but clear. Danny spoke, and his words were carried by broadcast to 1,000 star systems. 10 billion people died here, he said. They died because an empire believed that cruelty was strength, that fear was loyalty, that silence was obedience. They were wrong about all of it. We are not a species that kneels. None of us are. And from today forward, no one in this galaxy will have to. The coalition became the foundation of the Free Galactic Assembly, a union built not on domination, but on the idea that every species had the right to exist without fear. Humanity, the species that had been burned and broken and nearly erased, became the cornerstone of that new order, not because they were the strongest or the most advanced, but because they had been the first to stand up when standing up meant almost certain death. Sam Harding spent the rest of his life on Mars. He led the rebuilding effort, overseeing the construction of new domes and new cities that rose from the ashes of the old ones. At the site of New Providence, he built a memorial, a vast wall of glass etched with the names of every person who had died in the massacre. There were so many names that the wall stretched for kilometers, shining in the pale Martian sunlight. At its center, carved in stone, were 3 words. They became the motto of the new republic, and they were spoken by humans and aliens alike, across the galaxy for centuries to come. Mars remembers. Always. The year was 2389, and humanity had done what it always dreamed of doing. It had left Earth. It had spread across the solar system like seeds carried on a wind that never stopped blowing. There were colonies on Europa and Titan. There were research stations orbiting Jupiter. But the crown jewel of human expansion, where more people lived than anywhere else besides Earth itself, was Mars. Mars was home to 10 billion people. They lived beneath enormous biodomes that stretched across the red dust for hundreds of kilometers. They had built cities with tall towers and wide streets, and parks filled with engineered trees that turned carbon dioxide into oxygen. They had factories and shipyards and universities and hospitals. Children were born on Mars who had never seen Earth with their own eyes, and they called the red soil home without a second thought. Mars was not just a colony anymore. It was a civilization. Sam Harding was one of those people. He was 34 years old and worked as an engineer in the deep maintenance tunnels beneath the city of New Providence. It was not glamorous work. He spent his days 3 kilometers underground, repairing water pipes and power conduits and ventilation systems. But he was good at it, and he liked the quiet of the tunnels, and he went home every night to a small apartment where he could see the dome lights fading to simulate a sunset. He had no idea that his entire world was about to end. The Dominion of Verith arrived without warning. One day the skies were empty, and the next day they were full. Thousands of ships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, appeared in orbit around Earth. They were dark and angular, like weapons forged into the shape of vessels. They blocked out the stars. The Verith were an ancient empire. They had ruled over 9,000 star systems for more than 2,000 years. They had conquered hundreds of species, and they had done it the same way every time. They arrived with overwhelming force, demanded total surrender, and crushed anyone who refused. It was efficient, it was brutal, and it had never failed. Their leader was the Supreme Archon, a towering reptilian creature named Korath Vel. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, with dark green scales and eyes like molten copper. He addressed humanity from the bridge of his flagship, the Throne of Eternity, and his message was simple: surrender. serve the Dominion, or be destroyed. Earth surrendered in 72 hours. The governments of the world looked at the fleet above them and did the math. Humanity had no weapons that could scratch those ships. So, they signed the papers and bowed their heads, and hoped that obedience would keep them alive. But Mars did not surrender. Governor Ellie Dawson of the Martian Republic was a woman of 56, with gray hair and steady hands, and a voice that never wavered. She had been born on Mars. Her parents had been born on Mars. She had spent her entire career building the Republic into something its people could be proud of. And she was not about to hand it over to an alien empire that treated living beings like property. She sent a single transmission to the Verith flagship. It was short and clear. Mars does not kneel. When Korath Vel received the message, he was not angry. He was pleased. He had hoped someone would refuse. It gave him an opportunity to teach a lesson, not just to humanity, but to every species in the galaxy that might be watching. He ordered the Verith Third Fleet to move into position above Mars. And he ordered every camera, every broadcast system, every communication channel in the Dominion to carry a live feed of what was about to happen. He wanted the galaxy to watch. The Third Fleet arrived above Mars and took position over the major population centers. The Martian defense grid fired everything it had. Missiles, railguns, laser batteries. All of it bounced off the Verith shields like pebbles thrown at a mountain. The Verith did not even bother to fire back at the defense platforms. They simply ignored them. Then they opened fire on New Providence. Plasma bombardment fell from the sky like rain made of light. Each bolt hit the surface with the force of a nuclear explosion. The biodome over New Providence shattered in the first 3 seconds. The air rushed out, and then the fire rushed in. Buildings that had stood for 100 years were vaporized. Streets where children had played that morning turned to rivers of molten glass. 400 million people lived in New Providence. The bombardment lasted 9 minutes. When it stopped, there was nothing left but a crater so deep you could see the raw rock of the planet beneath it. Sam Harding was 3 kilometers underground when it happened. The tunnel shook so hard he was thrown off his feet. The lights went out. Dust filled the air so thick he could not breathe. He lay on the ground in the darkness, coughing and bleeding from a cut on his forehead, and he did not know what had happened. He only knew that something terrible was going on above him. The Verith did not stop at New Providence. They moved from city to city: Olympus Station, Vallis Crossing, Meridian Hub, Dust Haven. 14 more cities, one after another. Each one burned from orbit with the same cold precision. The cameras broadcast every second of it. Across the galaxy, billions of beings watched as 10 billion humans died on a world that had done nothing wrong except refuse to kneel. The bombardment lasted 6 hours. When it was over, Mars was silent. The red planet, which had been alive with the sound of human voices and human laughter and human dreams, was nothing but craters and ash and the thin whistle of wind blowing through the ruins of what had been. Korath Vel addressed the galaxy from his throne. His voice was calm. "Let this be the cost of defiance," he said. "Humanity is broken. Let every species remember what happens when you challenge the Dominion." He believed it. Every word of it. But deep beneath the surface of Mars, Sam Harding was crawling through a collapsed tunnel. It took him 4 hours to reach the surface. When he finally pulled himself out through a crack in the rubble and looked up, he saw a sky that was brown with dust and glowing orange from fires that had no air to feed them, but burned anyway on the chemical residue of the plasma strikes. He saw the ruins of his city. He saw bodies. He saw the place where his apartment building had been, and found nothing but a flat plain of melted stone. Everything he had known was gone. Every person he had loved was dead. He stood there for a long time. He did not cry. He did not scream. Something inside him changed in that moment. Something quiet and deep and permanent. The man who had gone underground that morning was gone. The man who stood in the ashes was someone new. He found a dead soldier half buried in the rubble. He took the soldier's radio, wiped the dust off it, and turned it on. He did not know if anyone was listening. He did not care. He spoke anyway. "This is Sam Harding. I am alive. If you can hear me, we are not done. Not by a long way." The signal went out across every human frequency still active in the solar system. On ships hiding in the asteroid belt, in bunkers on Europa, in secret rooms on occupied Earth, people heard his voice. And one by one, in the silence that followed the worst day in human history, they began to answer.